Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome tonight. Promises to be an evening of very thoughtful discussions. This is the second in our series, Shaping the Future, which is really meant to bring discussion and focus on some of the most challenging issues facing education today. Our topic tonight is closing the achievement gap, as you know, and I think probably most of you would agree with me that this is really one of the most critical issues facing all of us, educators and community members. Last fall, we addressed another important issue, and that was the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. If you were unable to be there for that panel, www.education.jhu.edu. You don't have to write it down because that website is right here, and you can actually go on the website and view that panel discussion. And so I'm also happy to say that tonight's event is also going to be on that website soon. So in addition to that, we'd like to hear about your opinions, your reaction to tonight. Also, on the front of your program is a website titled soetalk.com. And so please feel free to post a comment or any kind of question or thought about the topic tonight. We are very fortunate to have an outstanding panel, including noted researchers, advocates, and practitioners, and their bios are on the back of the program as well, so please take a moment and become familiar with our stellar panel. And our stellar moderator, you will meet in a few minutes, Dr. Mavis Sanders. She's a professor in the School of Education and researcher for the Center for Social Organization of Schools. And then our panelist, Bob Belfance, in the end, say hello, his Hopkins research scientist specializing in dropout prevention strategies and co-director of the university's Everyone Graduates Center. Andy Smerick, next to Bob, is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Next is Andrea Foggy-Paxton, a program officer for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And finally, Kalman Buzzy Hedelman, former member of the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners and author of one of my favorite books, It's the Classroom Stupid, A Plan to Save America's School Children. What a great title, Buzzy. Well, thank you again so much for coming, and it is my pleasure now to turn the program over to Dr. Sanders. Mavis?
Thank you, Marielle, and thank all of you for braving that traffic on 95 or 270 or wherever you came from, points north or south, to be with us this evening. We are really lucky to have a great panel to discuss a very important issue, and I am delighted to serve as moderator for tonight's events. There are a couple of housekeeping things that I want to go over with you very briefly, just so you can have an idea of how the evening will unfold. Each of our panelists will have the opportunity to present based on their current and former work in education and in educational opportunities and outcomes for children and youth. They will have approximately 10 minutes each. After those presentations, we want to hear from you. We will try to include in this discussion tonight as many of you as possible. So we ask that when it is time for comments and questions, that you go to the microphones on either side of the room. And if we don't get to you, as Marielle mentioned, we do have a blog site. It's called soetalk.com, and we want to carry on this conversation on that blog site. In addition, tonight's proceedings will be taped, and you can find that tape at the School of Education website. So without further ado, I would like to present our first panelist, Dr. Robert Belfance.
Thanks, sorry. So I basically just argued that in the Pre-KK, we're not challenging kids to what they can do. They walk in with a certain level of knowledge that's equal, and we don't push beyond it. When we get to middle school, where we make a big mistake, is we don't realize this is when kids make an independent decision to be engaged in school. They can put the mask on and say, yes, sir, and be somewhere else. And if we don't recognize that developmental change and make middle school an engaging, exciting place for them to be, they tune out. They don't understand that what they learn in mathematics in 6th grade helps project their future. That's way too distant of an arc for an 11 or 12-year-old to make. We have to make it interesting in and of itself and capture their imagination and their desire for a sense of adventure and camaraderie. Flash forward to 9th grade. What happens now in the middle school, especially in high poverty areas, is the disengaged kids start missing school in middle school. And even in Montgomery County, there's 2,000 kids who miss a month or more of school in the middle grade years. Okay? If you're missing a month of school, you're falling behind in mathematics because it's a cumulative subject, right? And now you're suddenly behind. So you get to high school and you're further behind. And there we don't have smart remediation. We just say, like, learn it again. Relearn elementary mathematics. But the kids have learned some and they haven't learned some other. So when they say, like, you're teaching me stuff I already know, it's part true and part untrue. But it's enough for them to shut down because they sort of feel like we're babying them. And we're not diagnosing, saying, you know this but not that. Right? We're not taking the effort to figure out what they need to know and where we need to take them. Then flash forward, we get them through high school. And we often get them through high school if they're struggling by providing lots of structure, lots of extra help, lots of second chances. And then we say, congratulations, you've graduated, and now go navigate college on your own. And it's often community college, which is the least structured of environments. So they're going from lots of structure to no structure with no transition supports. And that's where another group of kids are lost. And then the other thing we do that's interesting is we often have a mathematics placement exam for community colleges, which often goes back and says, we're going to ask you to do paper and pencil calculation. Now, if you pass this test, we'll never ask you to do it again. We will move you into more advanced stuff that's done on a computer. But if you don't pass this test, we're going to put you in non-credit-bearing courses where you're going to learn how to do paper and pencil arithmetic. So there's all these decisions we make along the way that may seem okay at the time, but when you put the four together, not challenging them to what their abilities are in pre-K, K, and first grade, not engaging them in middle school and making it an exciting and enjoyable experience, not having smart remediation in 9th grade when they need it, and not helping with the transition to college, we create all sorts of places for people to fall off the track to being ready for college and career. So what we really need to do is to think about each juncture, how do we give the supports, both social, emotional, and academic, to keep kids on track and engaged with schooling. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Belfons. And now we're going to Andy Schmerich.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I know you're probably all tired after a long day, so I'll try to be as provocative and interesting and animated as possible. Don't hold me to that. Matter of fact, I want to make sure I go well less than 10 minutes so we can have lots of questions. But what I want to just begin with is I want to make 3 points. Somewhat related to one another, but not totally. And I'm sort of coming at it from a policy position because that's what I've done most recently, but I also think is the way that you affect most kids over the long haul by getting systems right and policy right. So the first point I want to make is about schools themselves. The achievement gap is not necessary. There's nothing hardwired into kids. There's nothing written in the Constitution or in the heavens that say that we have to have an achievement gap. As a matter of fact, we've had since the late 1970s what's been called the Effective Schools Research Body. We've known at the school level how to create great schools for disadvantaged kids and close the achievement gap. And I'm underlining at the school level because I'm going to move to the system level later on. But we've known since the 70s and throughout the 80s, 90s, and even today that there are high-performing schools in disadvantaged communities all across America. And these schools take all types of different forms. Some are traditional public schools, and there are many of them that are quietly doing excellent work, often below the radar screen, taking the most disadvantaged kids up to high levels of achievement. But this is also true in the charter sector that has been expanding since the early 1990s. And so a lot of these schools, they've got a lot of ink now, like the KIPP schools or Achievement First schools or Aspire schools, Noble Street, on and on and on, are doing remarkable things, again, closing the achievement gap. In some of these cases, in urban areas, outperforming white, middle-class, affluent kids in suburban areas. And the same thing is true in the private school sector. There's a long body of research that Catholic schools remarkably, almost miraculously, inexplicably, have been able even since the 1960s or before, somehow, in the language of the scholars, been able to more equitably distribute academic gains among different kids from different backgrounds. Now, this isn't true among all traditional public schools or all charter schools or all Catholic schools or all private schools, but the case is that among all three big sectors in American education, K-12, there are schools that are doing what we want to get done. So that's the first thing that we need to begin with. It can be done. There's no reason why it's not being done at a bigger scale. In order to get there, the way I think about this is three things need to get done, and all of these are happening slowly but increasing at an accelerated pace. And so this is point number two, these three things that need to get done. One is changing the teaching profession, and Race to the Top is pushing this, and this has been in the news a whole lot, so let me just sort of point out a couple things that are happening right now that is the current theory of action of how we're going to do this. One is a sense that we don't do evaluations of teachers very well, that we've been lazy about it, that we haven't been willing to say which teachers are great, which teachers are in the middle, and which teachers aren't doing so hot. Discrete research in a whole lot of places, like in Tennessee, for example, has shown that it is almost breathtaking, astonishing, the difference that a high-quality teacher can make for the most disadvantaged kids. Some people believe now that if a most disadvantaged African-American Latino kid born in a low-income community has 3 great teachers in a row, the achievement gap can completely disappear. Unfortunately, we know too little about who these teachers are, how you create them, how you mentor them, how you get them to stay in the classroom, and so forth. So evaluations are a piece of this. Another thing is how you tie that to meaningful consequences in the teaching profession. Everything from how you prepare teachers in colleges of education, how you compensate them, how you do tenure, how you do certification, and then at the other end of the spectrum, how you make sure that the lowest performing teachers don't stay in the classroom because kids only get one shot. So teaching profession is something that is changing a lot right now. The second thing is schools themselves, and this is something that we didn't think too much about or enough about, say, 20 years ago, but actually the charter sector has made us think more and more about this. That is, the schools of yesterday don't have to be the schools of tomorrow. A lot of people believe, and I'm actually one of them, that sometimes the best way to create a new culture, a high-performing culture, is to start fresh, to start a brand new school so you can build the culture of excellence. So when we think about creating new schools and getting the best professionals in there, we have to think about things like collective bargaining agreements. We have to think about things like length of school day, length of school year, how classes are taught, how long classes are, and so forth. So the point is, it's not just the humans that are in the building, it's the structures that are around them in the school. And the third piece of this is the system itself, which we think too little about. And this is one of my biggest interests. I mean, since the late 1890s, we've delivered public education in America through a single mechanism, that is the traditional school district, and I'm most interested in urban schools. We have had this delivery system that many of us have conflated in our minds with the idea of public education, and probably you do it too. When you think of public education, you think of the traditional school district, which has a superintendent and a big staff and a school board, and owns all of the public schools in a geographic area, and you assign kids to those schools based on their residence. Well, that's been around for 100 years, and it hasn't always served low-income kids in disadvantaged communities all that well. In more and more major urban areas like New York and New Orleans, and even in Baltimore, we're thinking differently about this, that maybe there can be different ways that you deliver public education that doesn't have to be through this old system. So that's the end of point 2. Teachers, schools, and the systems that schools run in. And the third point is something that, if I could change one aspect of the debate about public education, especially for disadvantaged kids, it would be this final point. And that is blaming parents and blaming families. My belief is that public education exists to take all kids, no matter where you find them, and bring them up to high levels of achievement. And that is a really, really tough job. But just because it's tough doesn't mean that we get out of our responsibility to do it. And so the teachers who are in the classroom and principals who are doing a good job of it, they deserve our utmost respect. But too often in our debates, we begin by saying, oh, you know, little Johnny, he comes from a disadvantaged background. There's only so much we can do. Or, oh, you know, Jane, her parents are divorced. Or, oh, she's very poor. She didn't come into school with everything she needed. There's only so much we can do. That type of language, and I hear this all the time, doesn't serve Johnny and Jane at all. Those types of excuses never help Johnny or Jane learn how to read. They don't help her or him learn how to do math. They don't prepare him or her to go on to college. Too often what those things do is they put a shield over the system. So when systems fail kids, we can go back and say, well, there's only so much the system could do because these kids had disadvantages coming with them. So my deep belief is this work is extraordinarily difficult, but it's extraordinarily important. And I wish we could change poverty, but I've gone from thinking that we're not going to change poverty. I mean, there's this belief out there that some people believe that you're not going to change education until you change poverty. And I think it's the other way around. That if we want to get rid of poverty, if we want to get social justice in America, we have to get education right first. So I'm no longer in the business of blaming families, blaming communities, not because I don't think that they could do more, but because I think that we can do more as educators to make sure all kids get a fair shake.
I think I can go home now. I think they pretty much covered my presentation. So I'm Andrea Foggy-Paxton. Good evening. Happy to be here. And I hope that I can turn this on, possibly, and quickly go through slides. You know, I'm at the Gates Foundation. We like decks. We do lots of decks. So I thought it wouldn't be right if I came here without some slides for you. And I'm going to try to go over these very quickly. This first slide, I mean, Bob really highlighted the fact that you really need a college education to compete in the labor market at this time. I mean, the notion that you can have a high school diploma and enter into the workforce and actually sustain yourself and a family is not realistic. And so to add on to the fact that you need a college degree, many students are graduating from high school with a diploma that really is meaningless. They're entering into college with 1 to 2 years of remediation required. So how do we think about preparing students not only for career, entering to the workforce, but entering into college with the skills that are needed to succeed? And so the pipeline of students that we focus on are minority and low-income students. And our goal is to increase the number of students who graduate from high school college ready. No remediation required. They're not wasting their dollars. They're not dropping out with these huge debts that they have to repay. And so by 2025, we hope to reach that goal. Our theory of action is much of what our colleagues here have shared around effective teaching, around giving personalized, individualized, real-time feedback. And I mean, there are 4 elements that I think are really important to closing the gap. One is around expectations. Everyone doesn't agree that all students should be prepared for college. Again, it goes to this notion that some kids will go to college and some don't. But there is this idea that at least we should prepare them to make that choice. And, uh-oh, I think I touched a nerve there. So one is the expectation that everyone has the expectation that every child should be prepared. Accountability. So once you have the expectation and you have these great teachers, how are you going to hold them accountable to that expectation that every child should be accountable? Just because you have great teachers don't actually mean they will make sure that every student is going to be on that pathway to college, right? And then skills. So how do you make sure that teachers have the skills that they need and that students have the skills that they need to navigate this whole process of preparing themselves for college? And then tools. So I think about the biggest crisis right now, our economy. Education is part of that crisis. And the number of jobs that are available. This is an article from last year that says 1 million jobs were available, but only 589,000 people were actually eligible for those jobs based on their skills. There's a huge gap and pipeline issue of people that are not really pursuing STEM as an opportunity, as a college major or completing. And so I really want to talk about this over here, this data that really shows that math is almost the gateway to getting out of poverty. Each extra required math course raised the annual income of black males by 15%. Reading classes, and more reading classes did nothing. And so it shows that even an advanced degree did not contribute to higher earnings for this segment of the population. It was really about having those quantitative skills to do the type of work that's required in the labor force today. And so I love this leaky pipeline. This is the leaky pipeline of here are the number of students graduating in the class of 2005. You got 4,000 ninth graders who entered. Only out of that number, a little bit over half actually graduate, go on to college. So you have some who actually make it, some who don't, who fall out. And then this number is the real scary number. only 277,000 of those who actually get through college actually major in a STEM major. And so when you think about how we close the achievement gap, it's not just about college readiness and high expectations, but it's also getting students prepared to enter into the real world and understanding what the market dynamics are. I can't tell you how many students I've talked to who are going to major in communications, business, marketing. And I start to talk to them about, like, have you researched and looked at the pipeline of jobs that are available? And I'm probably going to be the worst parent because I keep telling my 5-year-old, I'm not paying for you to major in a liberal arts degree. I'm sorry. So all that to say is, I know, it's really bad because I'm a poli-sci major. So all that to say is, you know, there is this disconnect between what is real in the global market, the competing forces that are now allowing no boundaries. Like, people are working in Australia for United States companies at all times. I mean, there's just endless possibilities of work. How do you start to connect students to this reality? And so again, the gap. Even if you have high-performing, low-income minority students going into college, that number is nowhere compared to the highest income, highest performing students. You have 79%, 74% who actually earn a bachelor's that are highest income quartile, highest performing, highest performing at 8th grade math for low income, but only 29% actually complete a bachelor's degree. And so, you know, all to say that the achievement gap is not just about students going to college and completing. It's also about them getting the reality of the labor forces, the global economy, and what they need to prepare for. I have the pleasure of working on the Next Generation Models team at the Foundation, which is really about innovation and looking for and identifying some of the tools that are needed to help us move into these next generation models. I'm telling you guys, you stole my show. So it's about creating technology that is effective in the classroom. It's not replacing the teacher, it's helping the teacher and the students have a better process and experience in the learning environment. So thinking about engagement, thinking about motivation, how to use games, simulations, to really motivate and engage students in these deep contextual environments that are often very stagnant if you're up on a board writing out problems. And so one of the things that really excited me about talking to the Johns Hopkins folks is that we know more about how the brain functions today than ever before. And so how do we really take what we know about the brain and its function to a whole nother level with using technology and making systems much more adaptable, much more personalized, and responsive to the individual student's needs and interests. So, I'm interested in brain research as a student. How do I dive into that and make that my area of expertise early on? If you look at the Tiger Woods of the world, you look at all the folks that have excelled at these, mastered these skills, right, within their field, they all started at a very young age. And they started at an age where their parents saw, this is what my child is really attracted to. I'm going to really nurture it and give them opportunities to master those skills. And just imagine if we all were able to do that and how much we can contribute to our world as experts in our own particular areas. And so that's really what I wanted to leave with you, is that it's not just about the college and the degree, but it's connecting all these pieces together so that students can be empowered to be productive citizens.
First, let me thank Johns Hopkins for inviting me and for sponsoring this. And if it won't count against my 8 minutes, particular thanks to my former Baltimore School Board colleague, Jim Campbell. And if I get a chance later, I'd like to tell you why I think Baltimore is, in fact, the leading urban school system in the country right now. And Jim Campbell of Hopkins has played a leading role in making that, setting that in place. Let me, in a nutshell, give you my plan to save America's poor school children. I noticed that my fellow panelists got applause. I hope you'll hold your boos as I present my plan, as set forth in my book. Two main parts to it. The first is what I call a new education federalism, and the second part is what I call better weapons of mass instruction. New education federalism. The problem with No Child Left Behind, in my view, is not that it went too far, but it didn't go far enough. And we need national standards and we need national tests. That's coming around. It's obviously senseless to have 15,000 school systems or even 50 states with separate ideas of what science should be or literature or so forth. And the second part of the national responsibility, as I see it, is for research and development. That's probably something we all can agree upon for a federal role. Federal R&D over the years has been terribly politicized and inept, and we're paying the price because we need research-based best practices to drive instruction. The third part of the national role, as I see it, is adequate funding. Teachers matter, parents matter, data matters, choice matters, accountability matters, but so does money. And urban school systems are still terribly underfunded, and when we get into classroom instruction, we're not going to do what we all want to do. We're not going to close the achievement gap unless there are money for interventions for students, and those are expensive, particularly, and cost-effective if they begin in the early grades. But the money simply isn't there. We have on paper things like RTI, response to intervention, and so forth, but it's strictly a figment of somebody's imagination because the resources aren't there to do it. So that is the federal responsibility. Now, you know, is that a federal takeover? Well, no. The way I see it, the feds would set what students are entitled to. They're entitled to high standards, they're entitled to research-based best practices, they're entitled to decent funding. But the locals would still set how you're going to achieve those goals, how exactly you're going to spend the money, and so forth. Now, to bring the new education federalism down to the local level, I believe the first step is to abolish school boards and to put mayors in charge of urban school systems. And I had a rooting interest in wanting to abolish school boards when I was on one, but now that I'm you know, on parole, I still think it's a good idea. The best governance models in the country, in my opinion, are Bloomberg in New York and Fenty in DC, and if we get around to Klein and Rhee later, that'll be terrific. Baltimore is an exception. Baltimore, to my knowledge, is the only school system in the country where a deep, bold reform was initiated by the school board and not by the mayor. So I think we need to abolish school boards. I think we need to put mayors in charge, executive accountability. We eliminate the layers of diffusion of accountability. And we need to bring in bold, non-traditional leadership. I think by far the best superintendent CEOs in this country in the last 5 to 10 years have been non-traditional educators. And again, you got Joel Klein, you got Andres Alonso, you got Michelle Rhee, you got Arnie Duncan, you had Roy Romer in Atlanta, you had Elliot Burson in San Diego, Paul Vallis, and so forth. So I think you need non-traditional, bold leadership to set the reform, how you're going to go about reforming the schools in motion. Then to the second major element, which is better weapons of mass instruction. Now, we all know how screwed up school system bureaucracies are. And we read about misplaced records and data, and the heating system doesn't work, and this and that. But what is below the public radar and the radar of the education establishment, in my view, is how the design and delivery of classroom instruction is mismanaged. And what I mean by that, the selection of curricula, the alignment of expectations of teachers with reasonable standards and expectations, including reasonable alignment between the number of students that you have in your class and what is expected of you. My work now is pretty much in special education, and if you take the average urban classroom and put 6 or 7 or 8 kids in there with IEPs, forget it. You're setting the teacher up for failure. So that's part of the issue of design of instruction. Needless to say, professional development is a big part of it. Teachers don't get it. They don't get the right kind of classroom coaching that is the best form of professional development. There's very little supervision, there's very little monitoring, and the quality of fidelity of implementation, needless to say, is weak. So that, in a sense, one other point about the new education federalism. Some of you may have noticed that I've left states out. That's not by accident. The race to the bottom under No Child Left Behind is just the latest example of the large-scale failure of states in this country to do anything serious about the achievement gap. That's not to say that there haven't been some states that have gotten a little bit ahead on accountability, and Maryland has the best funding law in the country. But by and large, states have done it. They never will. I know of no initiative, of no public policy in this country that's aided the poor and minorities that was not done by the federal government. If someone can name one for me, I'll change my, I'll write a second edition of the book. It's never happened, and for lots of institutional reasons, it never and adequacy and support that will enable the achievement gap to be closed.